June 24, 1945, 10 a.m. Moscow. Despite the torrential rain, hundreds of thousands of people packed Red Square and adjacent streets. The Soviet Union celebrates its great victory, 4 years of unimaginable strain. German troops had advanced to within 30 kilometers of Moscow, at the very gates of the ancient capital, yet failed to take that final step. Then came Stalingrad, the Kursk Bulge, Operation Bagration, the storming of Berlin, and now, triumph. Standing atop Lenin's mausoleum, Joseph Stalin, the man whose iron will and determination became decisive factors in achieving victory. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union withstood the darkest months of 1941, accomplished the miraculous evacuation of industry to the east, and mobilized the vast resources of a continental empire. His name would forever be tied to this victory. Magnificent yet terrible, purchased at an unimaginable price. Down the rain-slicked cobblestones march composite regiments from every front, 1,000 soldiers representing each. In total, 35,000 servicemen participate. These are the true heroes, those who held the line at Moscow, who fought through the ruins of Stalingrad, who stormed the Reichstag in Berlin. Their parade uniforms glisten in the downpour, yet nothing can diminish their pride. Then comes the parade's most symbolic moment. To the relentless beat of drums, soldiers specially trained for this ritual cast 200 captured German standards before Lenin's tomb, Hitler's personal banner among them. Wearing gloves to avoid direct contact with the reviled symbols, they hurl the Nazi colors into the mud. This ceremonial act proclaims the Third Reich's final humiliation. This was no ordinary military review. It was the triumph of a victorious people, a symbol that history's most terrible trials had passed. And at the center of this triumph stood Stalin, the man who, for millions of Soviet citizens, personified victory itself. His path to power began in the small Georgian town of Gori, where in 1878, a boy named Soso Djugashvili was born to a cobbler and a washerwoman. The childhood of the future leader was marked by hardship, beatings from an alcoholic father, poverty, and a constant struggle for survival. These early trials forged a character that would later manifest in ruthless determination and iron will. His ascent was anything but predetermined. Expelled from theological seminary for revolutionary ideas, the young Stalin plunged into underground resistance, safe houses, secret printing presses, the ever-present threat of arrest. 6 exiles to Siberia, daring escapes, life under assumed names. Each of these chapters shaped the future ruler of the Soviet Union. To understand the origins of Stalin's rise, one must immerse oneself in the realities of the Russia that shaped his character. At the turn of the 20th century, Nicholas II's Russian Empire presented a glaring paradox. A vast territory with inexhaustible resources, yet a horrifically backward economy. 85% of the population lived in villages, with industrial output per capita 5 to 8 times lower than in England or Germany. Meanwhile, the wealthiest 1% of families controlled more capital than all other social strata combined. While Germany and England fully embraced electricity and assembly line production, Russian peasants still plowed fields with wooden plows. The country had 15 times fewer railways, that symbol of progress, than the United States, despite having twice the territory. The bitter irony: a nation that fed half of Europe regularly suffered from famine. In 1891 to 1902 alone, over 400,000 people died of starvation. When World War I erupted, the fragility of imperial power became terrifyingly apparent. The very first battles of 1914 ended in disaster. The East Prussian offensive, where the Russian army advanced to relieve its allies, culminated in the annihilation of 2 corps at Tannenberg. 90,000 dead and wounded, 50,000 captured, such losses in mere days. And these were the best trained troops, the cream of the officer corps. By 1915, the situation grew dire. Shortages of rifles, 3 for every 5 soldiers, artillery shells, even boots. At the front, a saying emerged: We fight barehanded against German machine guns. 1916 brought new humiliations. The Brusilov offensive, which began triumphantly, stalled due to lack of reserves and supplies. While soldiers perished in the swamps of Volhynia, ministers in Petrograd quarreled over appointments, and the royal family remained under Rasputin's sway. By the winter of 1916-17, inflation hit 400%. Railroads buckled under strain, and bread rationing was introduced in the capital. At the front, fraternization with the enemy began. In the countryside, spontaneous looting of manor estates spread. It was in this hell that Stalin's political style took shape. While liberal politicians debated constitutions in salons, he built an underground network of cells across the country. When conscripted in 1916, the cunning revolutionary secured a medical exemption, forging documents citing his childhood arm injury. As millions of peasants died at the front, the future leader wrote from Siberian exile, "War is a festering wound that will hasten the collapse of this rotten regime." His prediction proved grimly accurate. February 1917 found Stalin in Turokhansk exile. When news of Nicholas II's abdication reached those remote lands, he was among the first to depart for Petrograd. 3 weeks through snowbound Siberia, then on overcrowded trains. The future dictator's path to power wound through the empire's ruins, where soldiers' committees ousted officers at will, and peasants burned manor houses. In this chaos, he saw what others missed, not a threat, but an opportunity. Order out of chaos. This principle would become the cornerstone of his future system. The year is 1917. Russia stands on the brink. World War I still rages on. There's a food shortage, unemployment is high, prices are climbing, and, honestly, people are just exhausted and angry. Everyone wants change, but nobody's really sure what kind. First, Tsar Nicholas II is removed from power. That happened in February, and a lot of people thought, finally, things are going to get better. But they didn't. The new provisional government couldn't quite get a handle on the chaos. In fact, things only got worse. Then, in October, the Bolsheviks step in. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, didn't just want to swap out one group of leaders for another. He wanted to rebuild the system from the ground up. Laws, work, power structures, even daily life. His message was simple but bold. Power to the people, land to the peasants, factories to the workers. Sounds good, right? And for many, it felt like a real chance to start over. But it wasn't peaceful. A civil war broke out. On one side were the Reds, the Bolsheviks and their supporters. On the other side, the Whites, who opposed the revolution and wanted the old way back. The country split in two. Families fought, neighbors turned against each other, and everyone had to choose a side. It was a time of violence, fear, hunger, and massive uncertainty. That was Russia back then, stuck on a seesaw, with no one knowing which way it would tilt next. When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they didn't exactly have a detailed plan on how to run such a huge country. A lot of things were, well, improvised. But one thing they were sure of, the old system had to go, completely. They started changing everything. Old laws were scrapped. The traditional courts were shut down. Parliament, gone. Instead, they set up Soviets, local councils made up of workers, soldiers, and peasants. On paper, this was supposed to be true people's power. But in reality, most of the decisions came from a small group of top Bolsheviks. Lenin believed that a real revolution required tough measures. He introduced what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Basically, the working class had all the power, but under the party's control. To hold on to that power, they didn't hesitate to use force. Arrests, executions, banning of opposition parties. That's when the period known as the Red Terror began. At the same time, they launched radical economic reforms. Factories and banks were nationalized, meaning they now belonged to the state. Peasants had their grain taken to feed the cities, often by force, and usually without any payment. You can imagine how people felt about that. In the aftermath of the revolution, and following a few turbulent years in power, the Bolsheviks found themselves facing a new reality. The civil war was, alas, dragging on. The economy was in shambles, and Lenin, their top leader, was, indeed, getting seriously ill. That meant one thing: a quiet power struggle was starting. The question on everyone's mind was, who would take over next? Now, at first glance, Leon Trotsky seemed like the obvious choice. He was charismatic, brilliant, an amazing speaker, and a strategic mastermind. He had, after all, built the Red Army from scratch and played a huge role in winning the civil war for the Bolsheviks. Many, quite understandably, saw him as the natural successor to Lenin. But Trotsky had a problem, several actually. For one, even though he was admired, he didn't have many close allies within the party's inner circle. His confident, sharp style often rubbed other leaders the wrong way. Some thought he was arrogant. And while he inspired soldiers and workers, he didn't spend much time building up political support where it really counted, inside the party machine. On top of that, Trotsky's vision for the future didn't quite match what many Bolsheviks were starting to believe. He pushed for a worldwide revolution. He thought the Soviet Union wouldn't survive unless socialism spread to other countries fast. It was a bold idea, but also risky. Meanwhile, other leaders, like Stalin, were preaching something simpler: focus on building socialism at home first. So, while Trotsky had the spotlight and the resume, his position started slipping. Quietly, but steadily, Stalin was gaining ground, organizing, networking, and building a power base that would soon change everything. Little by little, Stalin began to pull ahead. And he didn't do it by making a big show of power. Instead, he moved quietly and strategically. While Trotsky was writing articles, giving speeches, and debating the future of the revolution, Stalin focused on the nuts and bolts of the system. He placed loyal people in the right positions, took control over key appointments, and quietly tightened his grip on the party. He made full use of his role as general secretary. On paper, it looked like a rather boring admin job, but in reality, it gave him the power to decide who got what position, who moved up, and who got pushed aside. That became his biggest advantage. By the time Lenin died in 1924, the outcome was already taking shape. Stalin had become too strong to stop. Step by step, he removed Trotsky from key roles, forced him out of the party, and eventually into exile. So that's how Trotsky, one of the most prominent revolutionaries, ended up outside the country. And Stalin? He became the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. When Stalin rose to power, the country was still, recovering from revolution and civil war. Everything was rather broken: factories, transport, firms. So, he set out to modernize the Soviet Union, and fast. First came industrialization. Stalin wanted to transform the USSR from a farming society into an industrial powerhouse. That meant building factories, power plants, railroads, essentially creating entire cities from scratch. In the 1930s, places like Magnitogorsk and the Ural region became major industrial hubs. People moved to cities in huge numbers and learned new trades. The working conditions were tough, but the economy, well, it started growing. Second, education. The government built schools, opened universities, and launched campaigns to eliminate illiteracy. Within one generation, literacy rates skyrocketed. Even in rural areas, reading and writing became the norm. Another big area was science and technology. The state began to support engineers, inventors, and scientists. Fields like physics, chemistry, and mechanics started to thrive. Many brilliant specialists emerged during this time, and they would go on to play major roles during the war and beyond. And finally, the military. Stalin saw that the world was becoming more dangerous, so he focused on building up the army. Better tanks, planes, weapons. Defense factories were built. Soldiers were trained. That would prove critical in 1941. The bottom line, Stalin ruled with a heavy hand. But his goal was to pull the country out of chaos and move it forward, fast. And in some areas, that effort paid off. When the Second World War engulfed the Soviet Union, on the 22nd of June, 1941, with Nazi Germany's surprise invasion, Stalin faced the most significant challenge of his life. The attack, alas, was sudden. The Red Army wasn't fully prepared, and the country was in shock. But almost immediately, the Soviet Union entered, shall we say, full survival mode. Stalin took control not just as the political leader, but as the supreme military commander. He became the face and brain of the Soviet war effort. Almost every major decision, military strategy, production priorities, leadership changes, had to pass through him. This centralized control meant that the whole country could quickly pivot toward defense. One of Stalin's most important moves was rapidly converting the economy for war. Factories that once made tractors were now building tanks. Plants turned out weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Workers pulled double or triple shifts. Some even slept at the factory. It was grueling, but it worked. The Soviet war machine kept running. Stalin also played a major role in keeping morale up. In July 1941, his famous radio address, starting with "Brothers and sisters," became a rallying cry. People listened and felt they could hold on. Later that year, while the Germans were still threatening Moscow, he held a military parade in Red Square. Bold move, it sent a clear message that the capital would not fall. On the home front, Stalin kept a tight grip. He made sure factories stayed open, supplies reached the front, and industries were moved east, far from the fighting. That saved Soviet production and kept the army going. Stalin was also deeply involved in diplomacy. He met with Churchill and Roosevelt, attended crucial Allied conferences, and held firm on tough negotiations. These weren't just formal meetings. They helped shape both the war's outcome and the post-war world. Discipline under Stalin was harsh, sometimes brutally so. Repression continued even during the war, but his grip on the country went one thing. The Soviet Union didn't collapse under pressure. It held together and pushed back, harder than anyone expected. Victory in 1945 wasn't just about armies. It was about the entire system Stalin commanded. For better or worse, he was the one directing that machine, and in the end, it helped defeat one of the greatest threats in history. People often talk about Stalin as a tough leader, a strategist, a man of power. But what's less known is that he was also a thinker, someone who seriously engaged with philosophy. Over his lifetime, he left behind 20 volumes of writings, covering politics, ideology, history, economics, and philosophical theory. One of his most famous works is on dialectical and historical materialism. It wasn't just an article, it became a kind of philosophical backbone for the Soviet state. Stalin tried to systematize Marxism, to make it clear and practical. He saw social development as a struggle between opposites, and ideas as reflections of material life. But for Stalin, philosophy wasn't abstract. It was a tool, something to explain, persuade, and guide. His writings were studied by party officials, taught in universities, and quoted in speeches. And while his style was strict, you can sense a drive for logic, structure, and clarity, like building a machine that works. Here's the key point. Stalin didn't just run a country. He tried to understand how the world works and how it could be changed. And in that sense, yes, he was a philosopher.
Раньше буржуазия позволяла себе либеральничать, отстаивала буржуазно-демократические свободы и тем создавала себе популярность в народе. Теперь от либерализма не осталось и следа. Нет больше так называемой свободы личности. Права личности признаются теперь только за теми, у которых есть капитал. А все прочие граждане считаются сырым человеческим материалом, пригодным лишь для эксплуатации. Растоптан принцип равенства людей и наций. Он заменен принципом полноправия эксплуататорского меньшинства и бесправием эксплуатируемого большинства граждан. Знамя буржуазно-демократических свобод выброшено за борт. Я думаю, что это знамя придется поднять вам, представителям коммунистических демократических партий, и понести его вперед, если хотите собрать вокруг себя большинство народа. Больше некому его поднять.
Stalin's legacy is enormous. One major area was science and technology. Under Stalin, the USSR launched its atomic program. In 1949, the country successfully tested its first nuclear bomb, a direct response to America's monopoly. Soon after, the focus shifted to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. In 1954, the world's first nuclear power plant was launched in Obninsk. Another milestone was the space program. It officially took off after Stalin's death, but the groundwork was laid during his time. Rocket development, research institutes, and training of scientists. Thanks to that foundation, the USSR sent Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961, becoming the first nation to do so. Stalin also built a strong education system for engineers and scientists. Technical universities were opened, and basic science was heavily supported. That created a generation of experts who would go on to build reactors and launch satellites. Here's the key idea. Stalin didn't just build factories and armies. He built the infrastructure for the future: science, talent, and technology. And that's what powered many of the Soviet Union's proudest achievements. People have mixed feelings about Stalin. Some remember the repressions. Others focus on industrial growth and victory in World War II. But one thing is clear. Many people admired him, and still do today. What's striking is that in modern Russia, there are almost no monuments to Stalin. His name isn't widely used in public spaces, and you won't find many streets or squares named after him. Yet, in public opinion polls, he consistently ranks among the most respected leaders. According to a Levada Center survey, Stalin has held the top spot in historical rankings for years. In 2021, 39% of Russians named him the most significant figure in history. By 2025, that number rose to 42%, more than Peter the Great, Lenin, or Putin. People associate him with order, strength, and victory. And while official recognition is limited, popular memory remains strong. That shows Stalin's legacy still sparks respect, curiosity, and debate.